Dust, silence, a town frozen in fear, and a man they all believed was beyond redemption. But in the middle of that silence stood someone who could see the truth no one else could. This is not just a Western story. It's a story about what happens when truth finally stands its ground. The takeaway is unforgettable. Justice without compassion is empty, and strength without kindness is meaningless. True greatness lies in understanding, forgiveness, and standing for what is right, even when you stand alone. If you want more stories like this, stories that stay with you long after they end, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive.
The dust in Bitter Creek has a way of settling on a man's soul. It's thick, it's gray. And in the summer of 1878, it was the only thing moving on Main Street when Silas Vance rode into town. He was a big man, a mountain of a man. He wore a duster coated in the grime of 100 miles, and his hat was pulled low. But it wasn't his size that stopped the clocks. It was the scar. It ran from his ear down to his jawline, jagged and white against his tanned skin. Folks called him grim. They said he had a heart made of flint and a soul that had seen too much blood. As his horse trotted past the saloon, the world went quiet. Mothers reached out and yanked their children into doorways. Men stepped back into the shadows of the porch, their hands drifting toward their holsters. To them, Silas wasn't a man. He was a ghost story with a gun. They heard the heavy thud of his horse's hooves, and they heard a threat. Then there was Claire Miller. Claire stood by the hitching post outside the general store. She didn't hear the leather creak. She didn't hear the jingle of his silver spurs. To her, the world was a series of rhythms she felt in the soles of her feet. She felt the heavy thrum of the earth as Silas approached. She watched the way the sunlight caught the grit in the air. Silas slowed his mare. Just ahead of his horse's front hooves, there was a small puddle left over from the morning's rain. A tiny brown sparrow was splashing in it, cooling its wings. Most men would have ridden right through. Most men wouldn't have noticed a bird at all. But Silas Vance pulled the reins. He sat there, stone still, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the dirt. He waited. He waited nearly a full minute until that sparrow finished its bath and took to the sky. Only then did he nudge his horse forward. Mr. Higgins, the store owner, was standing behind Claire, his face pale. He was trembling. "That man is a devil," Higgins whispered, loud enough for the whole porch to hear. "A cold-blooded killer. You stay away from him, Claire, you hear?" Claire looked at Higgins. She didn't need to hear his voice to know he was afraid. She saw the tightness in his jaw. She saw the way he avoided the cowboy's eyes. She reached for the small slate she kept tied to her apron. She wrote quickly, the chalk scratching a sharp rhythm against the stone. She turned the board so Higgins and the rest of the frightened townsfolk could see it. She had written, "Fear is just a fog, Mr. Higgins. It makes a good man look like a devil just because his shadow is long. Most people are so busy listening to rumors they've forgotten how to use their eyes. I saw a man who respects a life smaller than his own. That isn't a devil." Higgins read the words. He looked at the slate, then looked at Silas, who was now dismounting with a slow, tired grace. The grocer didn't say anything, but he didn't move toward his gun either. Claire wiped the slate clean. She felt a new vibration, a steady, rhythmic pulse. It wasn't the horse. It was Silas Vance, walking toward the store. Every woman in town feared the man, but Claire, she was the only one who had actually seen him. The road to the Vance ranch was a jagged line of dirt and stone. It didn't want to be traveled. It twisted through the sagebrush like a snake trying to hide from the sun. Claire Miller walked it. She didn't have a horse. She didn't have a wagon. All she had was a small satchel and a spirit that didn't know how to quit. The wind was her only companion. It pushed against her back. It carried the scent of dry pine and coming rain. She reached the gate by noon. It was a heavy thing made of weathered cedar. It hung crooked on its hinges like a man with a broken shoulder. Beyond it sat the house. It was gray. It was lonely. It looked like a place where hope had gone to sleep a long time ago. Silas Vance was on the porch. He was cleaning a rifle. He didn't look up when the gate creaked, but he knew someone was there. He felt the shift in the air. He looked up when Claire's shadow fell across the porch steps. His eyes were like flint, hard, sharp. They rested on the scar on his own face, then drifted to Claire's calm blue eyes. "Go home, girl," Silas said. His voice was a low growl, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "There's nothing for you here but dust and silence." Claire didn't flinch. She couldn't hear the warning, but she saw the way his grip tightened on the gun. She saw the way his shoulders stayed hunched, protecting a heart he thought was gone. She pulled out her slate. The chalk made a dry, rhythmic sound as she wrote. She stepped up onto the porch. She handed him the board. "You need a housekeeper, Mr. Vance, and I need a job. I am not afraid of your silence. I live in it every day." Silas read the words. He let out a breath that sounded like a curse. He leaned the rifle against the house and stood up. He was a head taller than her. He tried to loom. He tried to be the monster the town said he was. "I ain't hiring a charity case," he said, speaking loud and slow. "I'm a man with a reputation. People say I've killed men for less than a sideways look. You shouldn't be within a mile of this porch." Claire didn't move. She took the slate back and wrote again. Her handwriting was elegant, bold. "A reputation is just a coat a man wears because he's cold inside. I am not a victim, and you are not a monster. You are just a man who has forgotten that he belongs to the human race. And every human being, no matter how many scars they carry, deserves to have a clean floor and a hot meal. That is a basic right of being alive." Silas stared at the board. He looked at her small, calloused hands. He looked at the way she stood, straight as a lodgepole pine. No one had spoken to him about rights in years. No one had spoken to him about belonging. They only spoke about his sins. "You're headstrong," Silas muttered. He looked away toward the empty horizon. "That'll get you killed in Wyoming." He paused. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. "The room in the back," he finally said. "It's got a bed. It's got a window. If you're still here when the sun goes down, I reckon the job is yours. But don't expect me to be a good man, Claire. I forgot how to be that a long time ago." Claire didn't wait for him to change his mind. She picked up her satchel and walked past him. As she crossed the threshold, she stopped. She looked him in the eye. She pointed to her own chest, then to his. She picked up the chalk one last time. "Being a good man isn't a destination, Silas. It's a choice you make every time you wake up. Today, you chose to be kind to a stranger. That's a start. Don't let the world tell you that you aren't worth the effort of trying." Silas watched her go inside. He picked up his rifle, but his hands weren't as steady as they usually were. He sat back down. The wind picked up. It whistled through the eaves. For the first time in 5 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The storm didn't come with a warning. It came with a vengeance. By midnight, the sky over Wyoming was the color of a bruised plum. The wind wasn't whistling anymore. It was screaming. It hammered against the ranch house, trying to find a way inside. Claire Miller didn't hear the thunder. She didn't hear the rain lashing the glass. But she felt it. She felt the house tremble in its foundation. She felt the heavy, low-frequency vibrations that rattled her bones. She sat up in her small bed. The room was dark, but the lightning turned everything white for a split second. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. Then she felt a different vibration. It wasn't the storm. It was a rhythmic thudding. Someone was hitting the floor, hard. She grabbed a candle and lit it. The flame danced in the draft. She walked down the narrow hallway toward the main room. Silas was there. He wasn't the mountain of a man she saw during the day. He was crumpled on the rug in front of the cold hearth. His eyes were wide, but he wasn't seeing the room. He was seeing a battlefield. He was seeing the fire and the blood of a war that was supposed to be over. He was shouting. She could see his throat straining. She could see the agony in the lines of his face. He was fighting ghosts, and the ghosts were winning. Claire didn't hesitate. She didn't run. She walked right into the center of his storm. She set the candle on the table and knelt beside him. Silas swung his arm. It was a blind, desperate movement. His hand caught her shoulder and sent her sprawling against the wood box. Pain flared in her arm. She got back up. She didn't look at him with fear. She looked at him with a quiet, steady light. She reached out and took his hands. They were massive. They were rough. And they were shaking like a leaf in a gale. She pressed his palms together and held them tight against her chest. She wanted him to feel her heartbeat, a steady rhythm, a sign of life. Slowly, the tension began to drain out of him. The wildness left his eyes. He blinked. He saw the room. He saw the candle. He saw Claire. He pulled his hands away as if she were made of fire. He backed away until his shoulders hit the stone chimney. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "I could have killed you," he choked out. He put his head in his hands. "I told you. I'm a broken piece of iron, Claire. There's no fixing what's inside me." Claire reached for her slate. It was sitting on the mantel. She wrote by the flickering light of the candle. Her hand was steady. "You are not broken, Silas. You are just carrying a weight that was never meant for one man to bear alone. What you feel tonight, it is the cost of being human in a world that can be cruel." Silas looked up. Tears were carving tracks through the dust on his face. He looked at the scar on his jaw, then back at her. "I did things, Claire. In the war. After the war. Things that don't just wash off with soap and water. Every time I close my eyes, the ghosts come back to remind me who I really am." Claire shook her head. She took a step closer. She didn't write this time. She took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and wrote directly on the white-painted wall next to the fireplace. She wanted the words to stay. "A man is more than his worst day. Your past is a lesson, not a life sentence. Healing doesn't mean the damage never existed. It means the damage no longer controls your life. You have the right to forgive yourself, Silas. If you don't, you're just building a prison and calling it a home." Silas stared at the wall. He read the words over and over. A life sentence. A prison. "How do you know?" he whispered. "How can you be so sure?" Claire touched her own ears, then pointed to the window where the storm was finally beginning to break. She wrote one more line on the wall. "Because I lived in a world that told me I was less, because I couldn't hear. I had to learn to forgive my own body for failing me. I had to learn that my value wasn't in what I lacked, but in what I could give. You have a lot to give, Silas Vance. Start by giving yourself a little mercy." Silas sat there for a long time. The rain turned to a soft patter. The wind died down to a sigh. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He just reached out and touched the words she had written on the wall. "Mercy," he repeated. It was a word he hadn't used in a decade. It felt strange in his mouth, but it felt right. He looked at Claire. She was tired. Her shoulder was bruised where he had hit her. But she smiled at him. It was a small, quiet thing, like the first light of dawn. "Get some sleep, Claire," he said. His voice was softer now. "Not stones, just a man. I think the ghosts are gone for tonight." Claire nodded. She took her candle and went back to her room. Silas didn't go back to sleep. He stayed by the hearth, watching the embers. He looked at the wall. He looked at the words. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was waiting for the end. He felt like he was waiting for the morning. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon around 3 in the afternoon. It wasn't the light, swirling dust of a lone rider. It was thick. It was heavy. It was the kind of dust a dozen angry men make when they've got a rope in their hands and a hole in their hearts. Silas Vance was in the barn, oiling a harness. He felt the vibration first. A low, steady drumbeat through the soles of his boots. He stepped to the door, his eyes narrowing. He didn't reach for his rifle, not yet, but his hand hovered near the heavy holster on his hip. The riders pulled up in a semicircle, kicking up a wall of grit that choked the air. At the center was Miller, a man with a loud voice and a small mind. He was a rancher from the valley who thought a big hat made him a leader. "Vance," Miller hollered, "come out here and answer for your sins." Silas stepped into the light. He stood tall, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. He didn't say a word. He just waited. 20 head of Circle K cattle went missing last night, Miller shouted, his face turning the color of a raw steak. Tracked them halfway to your ridge before the rain washed out the sign. Everyone knows your history, Grim. Once a rustler, always a rustler. We ain't waiting for a judge who's 3 days' ride away. The men behind Miller shifted in their saddles. They were good men, mostly, but they were scared. And a scared man is a dangerous thing. They looked at Silas's scar and saw a guilty conscience. The door to the ranch house creaked open. Claire stepped onto the porch. She saw the horses. She saw the rifles. She saw the way the men were looking at Silas, like he was already a corpse. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked down the steps and stood right in front of Silas. She was a small woman, but she stood like a mountain. "Get out of the way, girl," Miller barked. "This don't concern you." Claire didn't move. She looked at Silas. He was tense, his fingers twitching. He wanted to fight. He wanted to prove them right. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest. She felt his heart hammering, not with fear, but with a cold, dark rage. She turned to the mob. She reached into her apron and pulled out her slate. She began to write. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound in the yard. It was sharp. It was defiant. She held the board up. "Justice is not a weapon for the frightened. It is a shield for the truth." Miller laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Truth? The truth is your boss is a killer. The truth is he's got blood on his hands from here to Georgia. We don't need a trial for a man like him." Claire wiped the board. Her hand moved with a rhythm that demanded attention. She wrote again, larger this time. She stepped toward Miller's horse, forcing the beast to shy back. She held the slate high so every man could see it. "A man, no matter what his past holds, has a basic human right to the truth. You claim to be men of law, but you are acting like wolves. If you hang a man because you are too lazy to find the facts, then you have surrendered your own right to be called civilized. You are not protecting your cattle. You are murdering your own dignity." The yard went quiet. One of the riders, a young man named Toby, looked down at his saddle horn. He looked ashamed. Silas stepped forward then. He didn't draw his gun. He looked at Miller and spoke. His voice wasn't a growl this time. It was steady. It was clear. "The girl is right," Silas said. "You want to hang me? Do it because you found my brand on your cows. Do it because you saw me drive 'em. But if you do it because you're scared of a scar and a rumor, then you're just cowards playing at being brave. Every man on this earth has the right to stand before his accusers with the truth between them. That is the only thing that separates us from the dirt we walk on." Silas walked to the hitching post and unfastened his gun belt. He let it drop into the dust. He stood there, unarmed, his chest out. "Search the ranch," Silas said. "Search every canyon. If you find one Circle K heifer, I'll put the noose on myself. But if you don't, you get off my land and you don't come back without an apology." Miller looked at the gun belt in the dirt. He looked at Claire, who was still holding that slate like a holy commandment. The fire went out of him. He knew he didn't have the stomach for a murder, not when it was called by its real name. "Search it," Miller muttered to his men. They searched for 2 hours. They found nothing but sagebrush and wind. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the men rode away. They didn't look back. Miller was the last to go. He didn't apologize, but he didn't reach for his rope either. Silas picked up his gun belt. He looked at Claire. She was leaning against the porch railing, her face pale. "Why'd you do it?" Silas asked. "I could have handled them." Claire took the slate. Her hand was shaking now, just a little. "Because your life has value, Silas. Even if you haven't realized it yet. Human rights aren't something we give to people we like. They are the things we owe to every soul, especially the ones the world wants to forget." To stand by and watch an injustice is to lose a piece of yourself. I wasn't just saving you. I was saving them from becoming what they feared. Silas looked at the words. He looked at the dust settling on the yard. He realized then that Claire wasn't just his housekeeper. She was his conscience. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a right to be standing on that porch. Summer in Wyoming is a slow burn. The heat sits on the land like a heavy blanket, making every movement a chore. But at the Vance Ranch, there was a new kind of energy. Silas wanted to talk, not with his voice, but with his hands. It started at the kitchen table. The breakfast dishes were cleared. The smell of coffee and fried bacon still hung in the air. Silas sat across from Claire, his large, calloused hands resting on the wood. "Teach me," he said. He pointed to a cup of water. Claire smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the morning feel cooler. She held up her hand, forming a C with her fingers, then brought it to her lips. Silas tried to mimic her. His fingers were stiff. They were used to gripping reins and pulling triggers, not forming delicate shapes in the air. He felt clumsy. He felt foolish. "I look like a bear trying to thread a needle," he grunted. Claire shook her head. She took his hand in hers. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm. She moved his thumb a fraction of an inch. She showed him water, then she showed him bread, then sun. For an hour they sat there. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the occasional sigh of the wind. By the end of the week, Silas could sign a full sentence. It wasn't pretty. It was slow. But it was theirs. One evening, as the shadows were growing long, they sat on the porch. The work was done. The horses were fed. Silas watched Claire as she looked out at the mountains. She was watching the way the light changed from gold to purple. She didn't need to hear the birds to know the day was ending. Silas tapped her shoulder. She turned, her eyes bright. He began to sign. He struggled with the word smart, his fingers fumbling. He stopped, frustrated, and pulled out a scrap of paper. He wrote it down and handed it to her. "I spent my whole life thinking you were less because of the silence. I thought I had to be your ears. I thought I had to lead you." He paused, then began to sign again, his movements more fluid now. He looked her straight in the eye. "I was wrong," he signed. "You see more than I do." He took the paper back and wrote a long paragraph. He wanted to make sure she understood exactly what he was feeling. "I've met men who can hear a pin drop a mile away, but they can't hear the pain in their own wives' hearts. I've met men with perfect speech who never say a word worth listening to. You don't have a disability, Claire. You have a different way of being whole. In fact, you're more able than most folks in town because you don't let the noise of the world distract you from what matters. We are equals in this house. Not because I'm being kind, but because you earned that spot with your mind and your spirit." Claire read the words. She bit her lip. She looked at Silas. Really looked at him. She saw the man beneath the scar. She saw the student. She took the pencil from him. "Equality isn't about having the same tools, Silas. It's about having the same value. Most people look at me and see a broken window. You looked at me and saw the light coming through it. The only real disability in this world is a closed-off soul that refuses to learn. As long as we keep learning from each other, neither of us is truly alone." Silas took her hand then. He didn't sign. He didn't write. He just squeezed it. He realized then that he wasn't just learning a new language. He was learning a new way to be a man. He didn't have to be the loudest or the strongest to be important. He just had to be present. He had to be willing to listen with his eyes and speak with his heart. As the first stars began to peek through the Wyoming sky, Silas Vance realized he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a partner. And in the quiet of the porch, the silence felt less like a void and more like a conversation that was just getting started. The air in Bitter Creek didn't just turn cold, it turned sour. It was the kind of morning where the sky looks like an old tin bucket, gray, dented, and heavy with a rain that wouldn't fall. Silas felt it in his knees. Claire felt it in the way the horses wouldn't settle. They kept pacing the stalls, their hooves making a restless, uneven beat on the dirt floor. "Something's coming," Silas said. He was standing by the porch rail, watching the road. Claire came out beside him. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She could see the way the birds were staying low in the brush. She could see the tension in Silas's jaw. They needed salt and flour. The ranch was running low, and the winter wouldn't wait for a man's pride. Silas didn't want her to go into town alone, not after the mob. But he had a fence line to repair that wouldn't hold through a high wind. "Stay on the main road," Silas signed. His hands were getting faster, surer. "Trust no one with a badge, and everyone with a hungry look." Claire nodded. She hitched the small pony to the buckboard and headed for town. Bitter Creek looked different today. It looked busy. Men in suits, not denim and leather, but expensive wool, were standing on the boardwalk. They looked like vultures in top hats. They were pointing at maps. They were measuring the distance between the hills with their eyes. Claire walked into the general store. Mr. Higgins was there, but he wouldn't look her in the eye. He was busy serving Sheriff Whitaker. Whitaker was the pride of the county. He had a gold star that caught the morning light and a smile that made the ladies feel safe. He was a good man. That's what the town said. He attended church. He shook hands. He kept the peace with a firm but fair hand. Claire stood by the shelf of canned peaches, her back turned. But she wasn't looking at the labels. She was looking at the reflection in the window glass. Sheriff Whitaker was leaning over the counter talking to a man in a dark suit. A speculator. Claire focused. The world went away. The noise of the store was nothing to her, but the movement of their lips was everything. It was a secret language they thought was safe, because they were speaking softly. "The Vance property is the key." The sheriff's lips moved. "The railroad needs that ridge for the grade. If we can't buy it cheap, we take it. The cattle was just the start. If he stays, he's a target. If he dies, the land goes to the county. And I am the county." The speculator grinned. "And the girl?" The sheriff shrugged. It was a cold, careless movement. "A witness who can't speak is no witness at all. She's a ghost. No one listens to a ghost." Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind. It was the chill of a predator sitting in a position of power. She bought her supplies. She kept her head down. She walked out of that store with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't drive the pony. She raced it. Silas was waiting by the gate. He saw her face, and he knew. They sat at the kitchen table. The candle between them was short, flickering in the draft. Claire grabbed her slate. She didn't just write. She carved the words into the stone. She told him everything. The railroad, the sheriff. The plan to turn Silas into a dead man so they could turn his land into a profit. Silas read it. He didn't explode. He didn't reach for his gun. He just sat there, looking at the words. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it had a weight. "I spent 4 years fighting for a flag," Silas said quietly. His voice was hollow. "I thought the law was a line in the sand. Something you didn't cross." He looked at Claire. He looked at her small, steady hands. He realized then that he had to say the truth out loud. He couldn't just think it. He had to give her the lesson he had learned the hard way. "Claire," he said, leaning in so she could see his lips clearly, "listen to me, because this is something they don't teach you in school books." He paused, making sure she was with him. "Authority and integrity, they ain't the same thing. Not by a long shot. A man can wear a badge, he can wear a suit, he can have the whole town tipping their hats to him, and he can still be a thief in his heart. A badge is just a piece of tin. It gives a man power, but it don't give him character." He stood up and paced the small room. "There's a difference between what's legal and what's right. The sheriff, he's got the law on his side today. He's got the paperwork and the public's trust. But he's got no integrity. Integrity is what a man does when he's in the dark. It's what he does when he thinks no one, not even a girl who can't hear, is watching." He stopped and looked at the wall where Claire had written mercy weeks ago. "We have a right to this land," Silas continued, his voice growing stronger. "But more than that, We have a right to our dignity. If we let a man like Whitaker use his position to steal what we've built, then we're telling the world that might makes right. And that's a lie. A man's value isn't measured by his rank, it's measured by his honesty. Every human being has the right to be treated with respect, and no badge gives a man the right to stomp on another soul. He sat back down. He looked tired, but the fire was back in his eyes. He thinks you're a ghost, Claire. He thinks because you don't have a voice, you don't have a witness. But he's wrong. Your eyes saw the truth. And the truth is the only thing that can't be buried, no matter how deep they dig the hole. Claire took the slate. She wrote one sentence. Then we don't hide like ghosts. We stand like a storm. Silas looked at the board. He reached out and touched her hand. The grim cowboy was gone. There was just a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Not for blood, and not for land. He was fighting for the truth. The storm is here, Silas whispered. I reckon it's time we showed them what it looks like when the quiet people finally decide to speak up. He went to the corner of the room and picked up his Winchester. He didn't check the sights. He just held it. Outside, the first real crack of thunder rolled across the Wyoming plains. The rain finally began to fall. It was cold, it was hard, and it was exactly what the earth needed to wash away the dust. The mud didn't just stick, it pulled. Every step the horses took was a struggle, a wet sucking sound that echoed against the canyon walls. Silas and Claire were deep in the Black Ridge now. The pines here were old and thick, their branches heavy with the weight of a rain that refused to quit. It was the kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat and settled in your marrow. Silas led the way. He kept his eyes on the trail, but his mind was on the men behind them. Whitaker wouldn't come himself. Not yet. He'd send the deputies, the ones with the hollow eyes and the scarred knuckles. Men who didn't care about the law, only about the paycheck at the end of the ride. They stopped near a narrow pass where the granite leaned over the trail like a frozen wave. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the muck. He turned to Claire. She was shivering, her face pale, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the ground. She hopped down and walked to a flat rock. She knelt, pressing her palm flat against the stone. She closed her eyes. Silas watched her. He didn't say a word. He waited. Claire's eyes snapped open. She held up 3 fingers. Then she pointed back the way they came. She made a rhythmic motion with her hand. A gallop. 3 riders, Silas whispered. Fast. He hadn't heard a thing. Not even a pebble rolling. But Claire had felt the rhythm of the horses through the rock. The earth was her ears. They led the horses into a thicket of scrub oak and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, the sound reached Silas. The frantic beat of horses being pushed too hard. 3 men rode past, their dust turned to orange sludge by the rain. They were shouting, their voices swallowed by the wind. When they were gone, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence filled with a new kind of understanding. Silas sat down on a fallen log and pulled out a canteen. He took a sip and handed it to Claire. He watched her for a moment, the way she watched the world. Not with fear, but with a deep, quiet focus. I need to tell you something, Silas said. He leaned in so she could see his lips through the gray light of the afternoon. Something I should have said a long time ago. Claire tilted her head. She pulled out her slate, but Silas stayed her hand. No, he said. Just listen with your eyes. He took a breath. The air tasted of wet pine and old smoke. In this world, people like to categorize things, Silas said, his voice low and rhythmic. They look at a man like me and they see a weapon. They look at a person like you, and they see a victim. They think your silence is a weakness. They think it makes you less of a person because you don't fit the mold of what they call normal. He paused, looking at the horses. But they're wrong, Claire. Dead wrong. Human value. It isn't a math equation. It isn't measured by how loud you can talk or how fast you can hear a gun cock. A person's worth is found in their perspective. It's found in how they see the truth when everyone else is looking at the lies. He reached out and touched the rock she had knelt on earlier. You heard those men before I did, Silas continued. Not because you're a ghost, but because you're more connected to the world than any of us. You have a right to be heard, not with your voice, but with your presence. Every human being has a right to their own way of being. Being different isn't a flaw, it's a vantage point. You see the things we're too noisy to notice, and that makes you the strongest person in this mountain range. He stopped. He looked at her, his eyes soft behind the grit. I spent my life thinking strength was a fist, Silas said. But you taught me it's a heartbeat. It's the courage to be quiet and still when the world is screaming. Don't ever let a man like Whitaker make you feel like you don't belong in the conversation of the living. You are the heart of it. Claire stared at him. She didn't write. She didn't sign. She just reached out and gripped his forearm. It was a heavy, solid connection. She took her slate then. Her hand was steady as she wrote. Strength isn't about being seen, Silas. It's about seeing. We are not hiding from them because we are afraid. We are waiting because we know the truth is a slow-growing thing, and when it finally breaks the surface, no badge or gun can stop it. Thank you for recognizing my right to stand beside you, not behind you. Silas read the words. He nodded. He felt a weight lift off his chest, a weight he'd been carrying since the war. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a partner. All right then, Silas said, standing up. He felt the cold less now. They've gone past the ridge. We take the high trail. We get the proof we need. And we do it together. As they mounted their horses, the sun broke through the clouds for a split second. It hit the black ridge, turning the wet granite to silver. They rode upward into the high silence. They weren't just two people on the run anymore, they were a movement. And in the vast, echoing canyons of Wyoming, their silence was starting to sound a lot like a victory. The mud of the high country was still caked on the wheels of the buckboard when Silas and Claire crested the final rise above Bitter Creek. It was a Monday. The town looked small from up there. Just a handful of wooden boxes dropped into a vast, unfeeling bowl of sagebrush and dust. From this distance, you couldn't see the hate. You couldn't see the fear. You just saw the smoke rising from chimneys, peaceful as a prayer. Silas pulled the horses to a halt. His hands were steady on the reins, but his knuckles were white. He looked at Claire. She was sitting straight, her eyes fixed on the town. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked like a woman who had walked through a fire and found out she was made of iron. "They're waiting," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble. "Higgins, Miller, the sheriff. They think we're buried in a canyon somewhere. They think the silence finally won." Claire looked at him. She reached into her satchel and touched the leather-bound ledger they had pulled from the speculator's saddlebag in the mountains. It was the proof, the names, the prices, the map that turned Bitter Creek into a chessboard for greedy men. She pulled out her slate and wrote. Her movements were calm. "The silence didn't win, Silas. It just waited for the truth to get its breath back." Silas nodded. He nudged the horses forward. They didn't sneak into town. They rode right down the center of Main Street. The sound of the buckboard was a heavy, rhythmic thrum. Clack-thud, clack-thud. People stopped. They stepped out onto the boardwalks. They looked at Silas, mud-stained, scarred, and weary. Then they looked at Claire. She was holding that ledger like a shield. Sheriff Whitaker stepped out of his office. He didn't have his coat on. He just had his vest and that gold star. He looked at them, and for a split second, the mask slipped. His face went gray. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost ride back from the grave. "Vance," Whitaker said, stepping into the street. He kept his hand near his gun, but his fingers were twitching. "You're trespassing on a town that don't want you. I told you to keep moving." Silas pulled the horses to a stop. He didn't reach for his Winchester. He just sat there. The crowd began to grow. Miller was there. Higgins was there. "I ain't trespassing, Sheriff," Silas said. He spoke slow. He spoke loud. "I'm coming home, and I'm bringing the ledger you dropped in the Black Ridge." The crowd stirred. A murmur went through them like wind through dry grass. Whitaker laughed, but it was a jagged, desperate sound. "That ledger don't mean nothing. It's just scratches on paper. Who's going to believe a killer and a girl who can't even tell the truth out loud?" Silas climbed down from the wagon. He moved with a heavy, tired grace. He walked right up to Whitaker. He was a head taller, a mountain of a man who had finally found his footing. He didn't draw his gun. He did something harder. He held out his hand for the ledger. Claire handed it to him. "You're right about one thing, Whitaker," Silas said. He turned to the crowd, his eyes resting on Miller, then on Higgins. "Most folks here don't want to hear the truth. It's too loud, it's too uncomfortable. It's easier to believe I'm a monster than to believe their sheriff is a thief." Silas opened the ledger to the page with Miller's ranch marked for a forced sale. He held it up. "But here's the thing about truth," Silas continued. "It don't care if you like it. It just is." Miller stepped forward, his face pale. He snatched the ledger and read. His eyes went wide. He looked at the sheriff, then back at the paper. This is my land. You were going to sell my north pasture to the railroad for 10 cents on the dollar?" Whitaker reached for his holster. "He's lying. He forged it." In that second, the town held its breath. The air felt tight, like a bowstring pulled to the breaking point. Silas could have drawn. He was faster. He was better. He could have ended Whitaker right there in the dirt, and no one would have blamed him. But Silas didn't move. He kept his hands at his sides. "Stop it, Whitaker," Silas said. The command in his voice was like a physical weight. "Put the gun away." Whitaker froze. He looked around. He saw the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. He saw the anger. He saw the betrayal. He saw that his power was gone, dissolved by a few lines of ink and the courage of a man who refused to fight. The sheriff slumped. He let his hand fall. Two men from the crowd, men who had been in the lynch mob only days before, stepped forward and took his gun. They didn't say a word. They just led him toward the jail. The street went quiet. The crowd looked at Silas. They looked at the mud on his boots. They looked at the scar on his face. They didn't look away this time. They looked with a heavy, burning shame. Miller walked up to Silas. He looked at the ground. "Vance, we didn't know. We thought—" "I know what you thought," Silas said. He looked at the crowd. He saw the people who had wanted to hang him. He saw the people who had called Claire a ghost. He felt a flash of the old rage. He felt the urge to tell them to go to hell, to take Claire and ride away and never look back. But then he felt Claire's hand on his shoulder. She had climbed down from the wagon. She was standing beside him. She held her slate out to Silas. "Tell them about the poison," it said. Silas took a breath. He looked at the people of Bitter Creek. He didn't speak as a cowboy. He spoke as a man who had lived through a war and realized the hardest battle was the one inside himself. "Listen to me," Silas said. His voice echoed off the wooden walls of the store. "I've spent a lot of my life holding on to grudges. I've spent years hating the men who gave me this scar, and the men who sent me to war, and the folks in this town who wouldn't give me a fair shake." He paused. He let the silence settle. "But here's a lesson I learned out in those mountains," he said, "and I want you to hear it plain. Hate is a poison you drink yourself, hoping the other man dies from it. You people hated me because you were scared. You were scared because you didn't know me, and that hate was eating this town alive. It made you follow a snake like Whitaker, just because he had a shiny badge and a smooth tongue." He looked at Miller. "I could spend the rest of my days hating you for that rope you brought to my porch," Silas said. "But I won't. Because mercy ain't just about the person you're forgiving. It's about you. It's about letting go of that poison so you can finally breathe. We're all just lost folks trying to find our way home through the dark. If we don't start showing each other a little grace, we're all gonna die lonely." The crowd was stone still. A woman in the back started to cry. a soft, muffled sound. Claire stepped forward then. She took her slate and wrote. She turned it toward the townspeople. Human dignity isn't something a sheriff gives you. It's something you give to each other. When you look at me and see only the deaf girl, you are losing your own dignity. When you look at Silas and see only the killer, you are choosing to be blind. True community is built on the right of every person to be seen for who they are, not for what we fear them to be. Higgins, the storekeeper, walked into the street. He looked at the slate. He looked at Claire. He reached out, and for the first time, he didn't look past her. He looked right into her eyes. "I'm sorry, Claire," he whispered. It was a small voice, but in that quiet street, it sounded like a thunderclap. "I'm sorry." One by one, the people of Bitter Creek began to move. They didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate. They just started to talk. They started to look at one another. Silas turned to Claire. He looked at her, and the grim mask was gone. His face was open. It was human. "You did it," he signed. His movements were slow, deliberate. "You gave them back their eyes." Claire smiled. She took his hand. Her grip was firm. Her skin was warm. "Come on," Silas said, leading her back to the wagon. "We've got a ranch to fix up, and I reckon I've got some more signs to learn." They rode out of town as the sun began to set. The light was orange and red, casting long, peaceful shadows across the Wyoming plains. They weren't the cowboy every woman feared and the deaf girl anymore. They were Silas and Claire. And for the first time in 30 years, Silas Vance felt like he wasn't riding away from something. He was riding toward home. The first frost didn't bring beauty to Bitter Creek. It brought the blue fever. That's what the old-timers called it. It started with a chill that no blanket could cure, then a cough that sounded like dry leaves rattling in a gutter. By the third day, the skin went pale as milk, and the eyes turned glassy. It was a thief. A silent, invisible thief that didn't care about badges or ledgers. The town went quiet again, but not the good kind of quiet. This was the silence of a graveyard before the stones are set. Black ribbons appeared on front doors. The saloon was empty. Even the church bells stopped ringing because the bell ringer was too weak to pull the rope. People were scared. And when folks get scared of a sickness, they stop being neighbors. They start being strangers living in the same zip code. They shut their windows. They barred their doors. They let their friends die on the other side of a wooden plank because they were terrified of the air itself. Silas and Claire saw it from the ridge. They saw the lack of movement. They saw the way the smoke only rose from a few chimneys. "It's the fever," Silas said, watching the town through his brass spyglass. He handed it to Claire. She looked. She saw a woman sitting on a porch steps, head in her hands, completely alone. No one was stopping to help her. Silas looked at Claire. He saw the question in her eyes before she even reached for her slate. "We can't just sit here," Silas said. His voice was thick. "I know what you're thinking, and you're right. We've got the fresh well water and the herbs from the high country. We've got the strength they don't." They loaded the buckboard. They didn't bring guns this time. They brought jars of broth, bundles of willow bark, and clean linens. The first house they hit was Miller's. The man who had once led a lynch mob against Silas was now huddled in a chair in his kitchen, watching his youngest daughter shiver under a mountain of quilts. He looked up when the door opened. He didn't reach for a rifle. He didn't have the strength. "Get out," Miller whispered. His voice was a rasp. "You'll catch it. Save yourselves." Silas didn't listen. He walked over to the stove and started a fire. Claire moved to the girl's side. She began to bathe the child's forehead with cool water. Miller watched them, his eyes wide and wet. "Why?" he asked. "After everything I did, after the way I treated you, why are you here?" Silas stopped. He turned and looked Miller in the eye. This was the moment. The lesson that had to be said out loud so the walls themselves could hear it. "Listen to me, Miller," Silas said. He spoke with a rhythm that was steady and sure. "Because you need to understand this plain. Compassion is the only thing that saves us from becoming monsters. If I only helped the people I liked, I wouldn't be a man. I'd just be a part of a club. But we aren't in a club, we're in a community. He leaned over the sick man, his shadow large but gentle. I'm here because your daughter has a right to live, Silas continued. And I'm here because you're a human being who's suffering. Human dignity isn't something you're born with. It's something you earn by how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. Right now, you can't do a thing for me. You can't give me land. You can't give me thanks. And that's exactly why I have to be here. If I turned my back on you now, I'd be losing the very soul Claire helped me find. Claire reached for her slate. She had been writing while Silas spoke. She held it up for Miller to see. Tin tung jua ngui ve ngui, the love between people, is the only medicine that doesn't come in a bottle. We are here to remind you that you are not alone. When we stop being afraid of each other, the sickness loses its power to break us. Miller didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes and wept. It wasn't the sound of a man dying. It was the sound of a man being reborn. For the next 10 days, the rancher and the deaf girl were the only things moving in Bitter Creek. They went from house to house. They hauled water. They chopped wood. They sat with the dying so they wouldn't have to cross the river in the dark by themselves. They didn't wear masks. They didn't act like they were better than anyone. They just did the work that everyone else was too terrified to touch. They found the school teacher, Miss Gable, collapsed in the schoolhouse. Silas carried her to her home. Claire stayed up all night, signing stories to the woman's delirious eyes, hoping the rhythm of her hands would lead the teacher back to the light. On the 12th day, the fever broke. The first person to walk down Main Street wasn't Silas, it was Higgins. He was thin, he was shaky. But he was alive. He saw Silas and Claire sitting on the porch of the general store, exhausted, their clothes stained with sweat and soup. Higgins walked up to them. He didn't say thanks. He did something better. He took the broom from the porch and started sweeping the sidewalk. Then Miller came out. He started hauling water for the widow across the street. One by one, the doors of Bitter Creek opened. The strangers were becoming neighbors again. Silas stood up, his bones aching. He looked at the town. It was scarred. It was mourning. But it was breathing. He looked at Claire. She was watching the people. She saw the way they were looking at one another, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, shared understanding. I reckon they learned the lesson, Silas signed. His hands were tired, but the movement was graceful. What lesson? Claire signed back. Silas took a piece of chalk from her satchel. He walked over to the big community board where the sheriff used to post wanted signs. He wiped away the old notices of hate and greed. He wrote in large, bold letters, "A man's wealth is measured by the burdens he shares. Compassion is the highest form of justice. We survived because we stopped looking out for ourselves and started looking out for each other." He stepped back. The townspeople gathered around. They read the words. They looked at the cowboy they used to fear. They looked at the girl they used to ignore. "That's the truth," Miller said, standing beside Silas. He put a hand on Silas's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of fear. It was a gesture of brotherhood. "That's the damn truth." Silas felt the warmth of the sun on his face. The frost was melting. The winter was still coming, but for the first time in his life, Silas Vance wasn't worried about the cold. He had enough fire in his heart to last a lifetime. "Let's go home, Claire," Silas said. They climbed into the wagon. As they pulled away, the church bells started to ring. It was a slow, rhythmic sound. It wasn't a funeral toll. It was a heartbeat. And as they rode toward the ridge, the sound of that bell followed them all the way home. A reminder that in the quietest town in Wyoming, the most important things were finally being heard. The winter didn't wait for the town to heal. It arrived in a rush of white wind and bone-deep cold. But for the first time in his life, Silas Vance didn't mind the frost. The firewood was stacked high, the cellar was full, and the house Well, the house finally had a heartbeat. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of evening where the world feels like it's holding its breath under a blanket of snow. Silas sat by the hearth, watching the orange light of the embers dance across the floor. He wasn't cleaning a gun. He was carving a piece of cedar, a small, delicate bird, much like the one he'd stopped for on his first day in Bitter Creek. Claire sat across from him. She was reading a book by the light of a single tallow candle. Every so often she would look up, catch his eye, and smile. It wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was a smile of belonging. Silas set the cedar bird down. He looked at Claire, really looked at her, and he felt a sudden sharp need to say something. Not with his hands, not with a slate. He wanted her to hear the weight of his thoughts through the air, even if she could only read them from his lips. He tapped the table. Claire closed her book and gave him her full attention. "Claire," Silas began. He spoke slowly, the words coming from deep in his chest. "I've been thinking about what happened in town, about Miller, about the fever, about us." He paused. He took a breath that tasted of cedar smoke. "I spent 30 years thinking that life was something that just happened to a man," Silas said. "Like a storm or a drought. You just endured it. You survived it. But you taught me something different." He leaned forward, his face serious but soft. "I need to say this plain because it's the most important thing I've ever learned," Silas continued. "Listen close. Love and respect. They aren't accidents of the heart. They are choices. Every morning we wake up, we get to choose who we're going to be. We get to choose to see the dignity in another person, even when the rest of the world sees a flaw." He reached out and took her hand. His skin was rough, scarred by labor and war. Hers was soft but strong. "The town feared me because they chose to see a killer," Silas said, his voice steady and rhythmic. "They ignored you because they chose to see a girl who was broken. But you chose to see a man worth saving. And I chose to read your slate when I could have just walked away. That choice is where our power lies. We have the right to define ourselves, and we have the duty to choose kindness over convenience. That is the only way a human being truly stays free." Claire watched his lips. She didn't look away. She let the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. She took her slate and wrote, but she didn't just write a response. She wrote a conclusion. "Choice is the only thing the wind can't take away from us, Silas. We chose to build a bridge across the silence. Now we have to choose to keep walking across it every single day." Silas nodded. He felt a lump in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold. A week later, the town of Bitter Creek did something it had never done before. A committee of 3 men, Miller, Higgins, and the new acting sheriff, a quiet man named Thomas, rode out to the ranch. They didn't come with ropes. They came with an offer. They stood on the porch, their hats in their hands, the snow dusting their shoulders. "Vance," Miller said, looking at the words mercy and bread still written on the porch wall, "the town is changing. People are talking. They're starting to realize that maybe the man they were so scared of is the only man with enough grit to keep things honest." Thomas, the acting sheriff, stepped forward. He held out a tin badge. It wasn't the gold star Whitaker had worn. It was silver, simple, unpolished. "We want you to take the job, Silas," Thomas said. "Not because you're a gunman, but because you're a man who knows the difference between a law and a right. We need someone who can see the people Bitter Creek usually tries to forget." Silas looked at the badge. He looked at the men. He remembered the feeling of the lynch mob's eyes. He remembered the loneliness of the trail. He turned to Claire, who was standing in the doorway. She had seen the badge. She had seen the offer. She didn't sign. She didn't write. She just waited for him to make his own choice. Silas turned back to the men. He didn't reach for the badge. "I appreciate the offer," Silas said. His voice was like the earth, solid and grounded. "But I've spent enough of my life carrying a piece of metal that tells people who I am. I don't want to be the law. I want to be a neighbor." He paused, looking at Miller. "But I'll tell you what I will do," Silas said. I will choose to help you build a town where a badge isn't the only thing that commands respect. I'll help you build a place where a person's right to be heard doesn't depend on their voice. You want justice? Don't look for it in a tin star. Look for it in the way you treat the person who has the least to offer you. That's the only justice that lasts." Miller nodded. He reached out and shook Silas's hand. It wasn't a handshake of surrender. It was a handshake of equality. "I reckon we can start with that," Miller said. The men rode away into the white afternoon. Silas stood on the porch with Claire. The wind was picking up, but the house behind them was warm. Silas looked at the cedar bird he had finished carving. He handed it to Claire. She ran her thumb over the smooth wings. She looked at him, and in that moment, the grim cowboy was gone forever. There was only Silas. He began to sign. He didn't fumble this time. His hands moved with a grace he didn't know he possessed. "I love you," he signed. Claire's eyes filled with light. She didn't need a slate for this. She didn't need a pencil. She reached up and placed her hands over his. She moved them together, a shared motion in the quiet air. "I hear you," she signed back. The years didn't just pass in Wyoming. They carved themselves into the land. They turned the young pines into gnarled giants and the dirt tracks into graveled roads. By the year 1912, the world was a different place. The high, lonesome whistle of the wind was now joined by the chug of the Model T and the hum of the telegraph wire. The frontier was closed, according to the newspapers in the East. But for the folks in Bitter Creek, the story was just reaching its final, quiet verse. Silas Vance was 82 years old. He didn't move like a mountain anymore. He moved like an old river, slow, steady, and careful about where he placed his weight. His hair was the color of a winter cloud, and the scar on his jaw had faded into a thin silver line that looked more like a badge of honor than a mark of shame. He sat on the porch of the ranch house. It was a fine porch, sturdy, painted white. Beside him sat Claire. She was 70 now, her eyes as bright and blue as a Montana sky after a rainstorm. She didn't use a slate as much these days. People had learned her language. The whole town had learned to speak with their hands, a gift they passed down to their children like a family secret. A young man walked up the driveway. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Silas's first 3 horses combined. He was a reporter from Chicago, sent out west to find the last of the outlaws before the history books were shut for good. He had a notebook. He had a fountain pen. He had a lot of questions. "Mr. Vance," the young man said, leaning in. He spoke loud, as if Silas were the one who couldn't hear. "They call you the Grim Cowboy. They say you were the most feared man in the territory. They say you saved this town from a corrupt sheriff and a deadly fever. I want to know, what was the secret? Was it the gun? Was it the grit?" Silas looked at the young man. He looked at the fountain pen. Then he looked at Claire. She was watching the young man's lips. She smiled, a small, knowing thing. Silas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked, a familiar rhythmic sound. "Son," Silas said. His voice was a soft rasp now, but it still had that cadence, that rhythm of a man who knew exactly what he believed. "You're looking for a story about a hero. But that ain't the story I'm going to give you. Because a hero is just a man who ran out of choices. I want to talk to you about the things that actually matter." The reporter blinked. He waited. "Listen to me," Silas said. He pointed to the town below. "Because this is the only history worth writing down. The true measure of a society isn't found in its laws or its buildings. It's found in how it treats its most vulnerable citizens." He paused. He wanted the young man to feel the weight of the words. "I spent my youth thinking strength was about being the loudest man in the room," Silas continued. "I thought it was about who had the fastest hand, but I was wrong. True strength is the courage to stand in the silence and listen to a person the world tells you to ignore. Every human being on this earth, no matter if they can hear or see or walk or speak, has an inherent right to dignity. That dignity isn't a gift we give them. It's a debt we owe them." He looked at Claire. She reached out and took his hand. "The secret wasn't the gun," Silas said. "It was the choice. We chose to believe that every soul has a voice, even if it doesn't use words. We chose to believe that equality isn't a goal you reach. It's a practice you live every single day. When we stopped being afraid of the different in each other, we found the human in ourselves. That is the only value that lasts. Everything else, the gold, the land, the fame, it's just dust in the wind." Claire reached for a small notepad on the table. She wrote something and handed it to the reporter. Her handwriting was still elegant, still bold. "The world will always try to tell you that some people are less than others. It is a lie. Our job, your job, is to be the witness for the truth. Respect is the only currency that never loses its value. Spend it freely." The reporter read the note. He looked at the old couple. He looked at the town of Bitter Creek, where a group of children in the distance were playing a game, signing to each other with a fluid, natural grace. There was no fear in that town. There was only a quiet, sturdy respect. He closed his notebook. He didn't ask another question. He realized that the story of the grim cowboy was a myth, but the story of Silas and Claire was a blueprint for a better world. "Thank you," the young man whispered. He tipped his hat and walked back down the road. Silas watched him go. He felt the vibration of a car engine in the distance. He felt the chill of the evening air. "He'll write a good story," Silas signed to Claire. "It doesn't matter what he writes," Claire signed back. "The truth is already living in the people." Silas smiled. He looked out at the horizon. The sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of violet and gold. It was a beautiful silence. He realized then that his life hadn't been a tragedy, and it hadn't been a legend. It had been a conversation, a long, beautiful conversation that had started with a deaf girl and a scarred cowboy, and had ended with a town that knew how to love. He closed his eyes. He felt Claire's hand in his. He felt the rhythm of her heartbeat, steady, sure, and full of life. If this story touched something deep inside you, then you've just stepped into a world where the Wild West is not only about guns and dust, but about love, humanity, redemption, and the quiet strength between people. This channel is dedicated to Western stories, cowboys, love across silence, human compassion, and the unbreakable bond of the human spirit. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
The dust may have settled over Bitter Creek, but what remains is not the memory of fear. It is the quiet echo of something far greater. This was never just the story of a scarred cowboy or a silent woman. It was a story about how easily we mistake shadows for truth, and how rarely we take the time to truly see another human being. Silas Vance carried the weight of his past like a sentence carved in stone, believing he was beyond redemption, and Claire, living in a world without sound, was treated as if she had no voice at all. Yet, in the stillness between them, something remarkable took root. Understanding. Not loud, not forceful, but steady, patient, and unshakable. What this story leaves us with is a truth as old as the land itself. A person is never just their worst mistake, nor their deepest limitation. We live in a world that is quick to judge, quick to label, and even quicker to turn away from what it does not understand. But dignity, true human dignity, is not something granted by reputation, power, or even society. It is something we owe to one another, freely and without condition. Claire saw beyond the scar. She saw a man still capable of kindness, of change, of choosing a better path. And in doing so, she didn't just save Silas, she gave an entire town back its humanity. The lesson here is not wrapped in grand gestures or heroic gunfights. It lies in the small, deliberate choices we make every day, the choice to listen when it's easier to ignore, the choice to show compassion when fear tells us to pull away, the choice to believe that even the most broken parts of a person can still be mended, not erased,
but transformed into something meaningful. Because healing doesn't come from denying the past, it comes from refusing to let that past define the rest of the journey. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: love and respect are not accidents, they are decisions. Just like hate, just like fear. Silas could have chosen bitterness, the town could have chosen violence, but instead, through Claire's quiet strength, they were shown another way, a way built on empathy, accountability, and the courage to see each other clearly. That is what builds a community, not law, not power, but the willingness to stand beside someone when the rest of the world steps back. So as you walk away from this story, carry this with you. The next time you meet someone shaped by scars, silence, or a past you don't understand, pause. Look closer. Because sometimes the people the world fears the most are the ones most in need of being seen. And sometimes the quietest souls are the ones who teach us how to truly hear. That is the spirit of the West, not just survival but redemption, not just strength but compassion. And in the end, that may be the only thing that truly lasts. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.